Thanks, Cheryl. Well, every now and again, I come across a fresh voice in the social media space, and my guest today is one of those great finds. Jin Choy is a Toronto-based influencer, psychotherapist, podcast creator and host, and communicator with a great knack for speaking into the voice of her generation with bold, fearless, and uncomfortable faith at times. Welcome to 100 Huntley Street, Jin.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to get right into your story because you've got a fascinating story. Growing up as a Korean Canadian and being part of a Korean Canadian congregation.
Yeah.
I just want to talk to you a little bit first to set a bit of the groundwork about your faith and what that was like for you. Growing up in that context, perhaps some of the cultural expectations, the dynamics that perhaps other people groups might not be familiar with.
Right. I mean, the Western Korean church is definitely an experience for sure. I think I grew up mostly understanding God as an idea rather than a person that you can have relationship with. And it was definitely it's something that they wanted me to learn so badly, but it definitely made it into like a study rather than a relationship. But you know what? Thank the Lord that He actually walked me through that, and then I got to actually experience God as a father, as a friend, and the Holy Spirit guidance really worked in my heart to really break that out of me. For sure.
So you'd say your experience with Jesus was a list of checking off the boxes, the do's and the don'ts. Your heart wasn't quite dialed in until you had a very interesting experience where your parents sent you on a missions trip at the age of 12 to Brazil, which I thought, wow, 12 years old sending someone on a missions trip, that's pretty young. But how did your understanding of Jesus shift after that experience, especially when you saw this powerful cross-cultural connection?
Yeah. I mean, it's just like how you said, like I was so focused on the boxes. I thought like, okay, so to be a Christian, to know God, to understand who Jesus is, I need to read the Bible this many times, and I have to write out the Bible. I have to do all these things so that I can say that I have a relationship with God. And that's kind of how I thought relationship with God was until I went to Brazil. I went to Brazil in 7th grade when I was 12 years old. And my parents, they just, in any way that I could just have more of like the Jesus experience, they will send me. And so I went with my church when I was 12 to Brazil. I went both to Rio and Sao Paulo, and we visited a bunch of different churches, and we were able to kind of see what missionaries there did. And there was a moment when we were in the slums of Rio, and there was a church that was basically built in a container and there was just chairs and there was kids everywhere running around, and we were given an opportunity to pray for the Brazilian locals and there was Koreans from my church who only spoke Korean. There was people like me who really only spoke English, only spoke English.
Right.
And then there was the Brazilians who only spoke Portuguese, but we were given a chance to pray for one another. And me being a 12-year-old kid didn't understand what that meant. And so I just grabbed like a 6-year-old kid and just decided
Well, you're only 12 at the time.
Exactly.
So 7-year-old was a safe call.
100%, because I don't want to sit with an adult and like try and pray for them, because that's awkward. And so I just sat with her and we looked at each other just, blankly. And I just saw all of the adults praying for one another, and they were all different ages, all different lifestyles, all different socioeconomic backgrounds, and they were all weeping and wailing and crying, and I was so confused as a kid, and that 12-year-old girl was so confused, because I was like, okay, like, what connection do they have with the person they're praying with and praying for and praying to that I don't? There's something that's different. They have a relationship with the person they're praying with and for and to, and I don't. And they obviously have language and cultural differences, but it is the God that they were praying to that really brought them together. And I think that really sparked a curiosity in me that never went away.
So it wasn't necessarily so the light bulb went off. It just started this journey of digging deeper and realizing what this relationship was all about, and that there was this very active person in the Trinity called the Spirit of God that actually connected us,
right,
regardless of what language we could speak.
Exactly.
you mentioned, so how long would you say, sort of returning from that missions trip, would you say that God really sort of transformed your perspective of your relationship with him, or really ignited that relationship in a meaningful way?
Well, I don't want to take too long. I could go talk about this for hours. But I think when I got back, it always just, I was curious. I was like, whatever they were experiencing, I wanted that. I wanted to feel that. I wanted to see that. But I think the only way that, like I said, when I grew up, I only knew it in a way that it's like a study, that it's like a like homework. And so that's kind of what I did. I did the church thing where I served everywhere all the time, being like, okay, if this is what it takes to have that experience, I'll do it. And I did that for so many years until I turned 24 in 2020. I was like, okay, there's a limit right now. There is I'm hitting a wall with what it means to relate with God in this context. And so God really inspired me to move out from that church, go explore different churches, see how they do life with Jesus, and really grow from there. So I think,
what were some of the challenges that you faced making that decision? Because that would be hard after 23 years being with one congregation, and in the context of your family, because that's where your family attended.
Right.
What was that like for you?
Honestly, 2020 was very difficult for me because I was going from a place that was so comfortable, where I felt useful, where I felt like, okay, if this is how I relate to God, and I don't have that anymore, then what does it mean for me to even be a follower of Christ if I'm not serving on worship or doing kids ministry or all of these different things? And I wrestled with that a lot. And then I went through a year and a half of no title, no serving. And that made me sit with the realization that my relationship with God is not works-based. It is not based on what I can do for the church in the context of the church building and the congregation, but it's my deep relationship with the Lord besides all of that.
Yeah, you described that as relational tension with Jesus when I was reading your bio. And I thought, that's a great way to put it. And the identity crisis that we go to when all of the activities that we do for the kingdom are stripped away. What's left? Right. Relationship is all that's left. And that's maybe what God needed to take you. And it was what he did with me many, many years ago when many of the opportunities that have been facing me kind of went away for a season. What did you learn about relationship with God outside of church ministry? Because this is where it became very sort of real to you.
Right.
And how did that shift impact your spiritual life?
I think it, like you mentioned, the relational tension, like the wrestling with what it means for me to see God in more than just like in a behavioral way. And I think that what really changed it is when I went to Tyndale and I took a spiritual formation course, and I learned the idea of contemplative prayer, and I understood the idea of sitting and being. And it was so difficult because it's like, how can I sit and just sit still and be with God? And I think relationally with God, it changed when I learned that was a concept in and of itself, because I didn't know that was a thing. What it means to just sit and be contemplative about who God is and what my relationship with God is. And to know that my relationship with God is so fruitful and has more weight and value just sitting and being.
It's like Mary and Martha, right? It's that being in his presence is as much a part of the act of service to that relationship that we want so desperately with him. Okay, bring us up to speed. Okay, we want to talk about On Water podcast. I think it's so cool. I've had the pleasure of taking in a couple episodes. Great conversation, geared towards your generation, and in the language that connects with all of us. I mean, I'm a few generations older than you. What's it with the name, and who's and what's your mandate?
Right. So On Water podcast was definitely something that was not. It's something that I did so that I can, like, I want to be an influencer. I want to be online. That really wasn't the motivation, but it was a stirring in my heart that God put within me about 2.5 years ago. kind of based on my testimony, but based on the story of Jesus and Peter walking on water. Just like in what I just mentioned, when I looked at the adults, when I looked at the other people experiencing God in a certain way, I was fired into curiosity to actually live that and to experience that for myself. And I think with the story of Jesus and Peter walking on water, Jesus walks on water first. He doesn't choose a boat. He just chooses to walk on water. He's magnificent in that way. He has a presence, makes an entrance. And the one thing he says to the disciples is, come. He invites them. And Peter, he's like, okay, I'm going to go. Despite all of my understanding about water, he was a fisherman, and no matter what he knew about water and the storm and
physics
and how dangerous things are, he's like, okay, I'm going to follow Jesus and I'm going to look at him. But turning this into a different perspective, think about the other disciples who stayed on the boat. Right. They didn't even try. They saw Peter take the step of faith to experience Jesus and his power and to be a participant, an active participant in that. But they allowed their fear and they allowed their doubts keep them on the boat and never experience the power of Jesus. And that's what I want to encourage those people who are still on that boat, is like, do you want to just sit there and be a spectator of what Jesus is doing, or do you want to be an active participant in what he's doing? Even if Peter had fear and then he started to slip and fall, at least Jesus caught him and he experienced him that way.
Wow.
And I don't want people to just sit in the boat and look at other people experience Jesus and miss out on that.
That's good, Jen. And you're a psychotherapist, so you're hearing people's stories in your office day in and day out, people that are being gripped by fear, that are being held back from what God ultimately has for them, the potential, the freedom that is there for them. So that's a whole other interview that we will save for another time. But just before we wrap up in the last minute here, what's your advice to someone that's frustrated trying to find their voice in Christian service? Because you were there and now you've found this. I mean, you're obviously a practicing psychotherapist, but you've also got this platform where you're able to speak into the lives of others. What's your advice to them?
I think it's looking for the place where God stirs you. I think a lot of people think it has to be a big grandeur thing, and which it might be, which is scary. I think starting the podcast was scary for me. But I think even one thing I learned was even either rekindling a relationship with someone that you had bitterness towards, or sharing the gospel with someone in your workplace, or just saying, God bless you instead of goodbye. Whatever God stirs in your heart, that is, like, when you want to serve God, it comes out of an overflow of the Spirit that out of the way that he convicts you. And it's never you're not doing enough or you should do more. It's the Lord has stirred me and has convicted me and has shown me that bold living and living fearlessly for the kingdom is better than just sitting still.
That is so good. Well, I know we could talk forever on this subject, but that is really good. Just responding to those small stirrings, it's beautiful. That's enough to take away from our conversation today. You are such a refreshing voice in the ever-growing podcast space, Jin. Thanks so much for being with us today, being so vulnerable and honest in your conversations and your approach to media. I think it's so needed, and modeling Christianity in a way that really connects with your generation. So happy to have you with us, and we look forward to having you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me again.
God bless.